So I think we're going to start. So this session, there'll be Barry Kosmin and myself. Barry Kosmin is going to be speaking on global anti-Semitism and the university, a 200-year-old problem. And I'm going to follow Barry, and the topic or the title of my talk will be Global Anti-Semitism, a Crisis of Modernity. And I'll introduce Barry. Barry is an old friend and colleague who's been involved with our summer program since its inception. Barry Kosmin is a research professor of public policy and law at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He's the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Secularism in Society and Culture. He's a senior associate of the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies at Oxford University. In 2019, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Humanist Association. And during his career, he has held several positions, such as at the Institute for Jewish Policy Research in London, which was a preeminent policy research center here in the UK. And he also served on the board of deputies of the British Jewish Council of Federations in London and also in New York. So Barry, thank you for being here. And the floor is yours. Again, the title is Global Anti-Semitism and the University, a 200-year-old problem. Welcome, Barry.
Okay, thank you, Charles. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. The universities are a good prism with which to study the question or the issue of anti-Semitism and the emergence of its varieties or mutations over the centuries. Anti-Judaism, national or cultural anti-Semitism, class-based anti-Semitism, race, biological anti-Semitism, economic anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism, and anti-Zionism. They all have been present, and I'll try and touch on a few of these at any over time and place. But what they do is they're all additives. It's very important to remember this is a cafeteria where people can pick and choose their prejudice, and it's additive. None of them fall away. All of them just add to the others. Issues or the other arguments. Now, in the suggested readings, I gave you a couple of things that I've been working on the last few years. Two surveys, one of American Jewish students and another of the leaders of in 28 European countries, the leaders of Jewish communities. Both of these raised the issue of anti-Semitism. They weren't particularly about anti-Semitism, but in both surveys, anti-Semitism came up. In 2013, Pew did a survey of American Jews, and they found that the older Jews are very unlikely to meet anti-Semitism. And so where one finds anti-Semitism today is amongst younger people, and particularly where a swastika is painted, not on shop windows, or at railroad stations, or even at sports stadiums, but on university campuses, on Jewish fraternity houses, and on banners on campus demonstrations. And what's the situation in Europe? This survey that we did both in 2015 and 2018, we surveyed these several hundred Jewish leaders, community leaders, and they were asked who were their allies in the fight against anti-Semitism, almost, always, or most of the time. A majority, interestingly enough, 54% said their national governments were supportive, while only 13% said intellectuals and academics acted as friends of the Jews. Conversely, when they were asked who they saw as a threat to Jewish communities, always or sometimes, 33% of the Jewish leaders in Western Europe cited Western European intellectuals and academics. So now my job today is to try and explain to you why Jews have had a continuing problem with the academy and universities. Let me give you actual real evidence of this. In December 2019, there was a election in Britain, the first since World War II, where a Jewish question, or the Jewish issue of anti-Semitism came up because of the association of the Labour Party and its leader, Jeremy Corbyn, with anti-Semitism. Now, the Labour Party actually went down to its biggest defeat since 1935. It only got 32% of the vote. But when surveys were done, they found that 43% of university graduates supported the Labour Party. This was a party where the chief rabbi of Britain had asked people to think about their consciences before they went to vote and vote for anybody other than Mr. Corbyn and his party. The Labour Party lost tremendous amount of support in its industrial heartlands to the working class, but it retained the support, especially, and retained its seats in all the university towns, in Bristol, in Cambridge, in Oxford East, Canterbury, Exeter, you name it. So obviously, these people were not particularly worried about being associated or supporting people who were associated with anti-Semitism. Now, obviously, one of the issues here is that most people think that education leads to enlightenment. You know, and the boorish masses are the people who cause all the problems in society. Of course, history shows quite the opposite. The leaders have always been well educated. It's more likely to be a bishop than a serf in the Middle Ages who was going to chop off Jews' heads. Now, of course, the issue is that universities were founded as religious institutions, both in the Muslim world, in Dar al-Islam, and in Christendom. In the Middle Ages, they were church foundations. And that's why today, if you go to Oxford, which hopefully some of you will, you'll see all the colleges have all got very big chapels. And very many of the ceremonial occasions take place in the chapels. All of them have chaplains who are Christian religious leaders, clergy. Let me give you another example of this. Oxford has, since 1535, had a Regius Chair in Hebrew, a royal chair, which was established, as also at Cambridge, by Henry VIII, the man with the 6 wives. He started off trying to divorce his wife, and he needed kind of biblical or Hebrew or Jewish religious arguments for this. Eventually went into the beheading business, of course, of the wives later. But he set up this Regius Chair since 1535. No Jew has ever held that chair. It has been in the theology department and has always been held by a Christian clergyman. That affects, of course, how Jewish studies operates in all these universities. Now, thus, Jews, of course, were excluded from the universities because they couldn't be part of a religious organization until the 19th century, until civil emancipation. The only university that allowed, in Europe, that allowed Jews to matriculate and graduate was the University of Padova in Italy, which was under the Venetian Republic. And it was the only university in Europe which was not controlled by the church. It wasn't just Jews, they allowed in Protestants, they allowed in Orthodox Christians, and even a handful of Ottoman Turkish Muslims. But most of the Jewish medics that you read about in Renaissance Europe were all trained at the University of Padua. It was the only place. Another example, of course, of this exclusion of Jews is that all the synagogues of Europe that you see were never designed by Jewish architects because they couldn't get to university. They were all designed mostly by Quakers in Amsterdam, in London, in Venice. The architects were all non-Jews because Jews could not be architects. Or any other post that required a university graduation, a university degree. So that's the exclusion part of universities, and they have a long history, and it's taken them a long time to shake that off. Oxford only shook it off in 1870. Up to that time, anybody who wanted to enter University of Oxford had to matriculate through the Test Act, and the Test Act was only for Protestant Christians. They were the only ones who could enter university. Now, you might think that, you know, this was the Catholic side, but of course the Protestant universities, and under Martin Luther, was a very big anti-Semite, they took over from the Catholic Church in much of Northern Europe, but they didn't change. They operated the same exclusion against Jews or non-Christians. So tolerance was very slow in coming. And it was only, as I say, in 1870 that Jews could enter Oxford and Cambridge. That's why in England, the University of London, founded by University College London by Jeremy Bentham, some of you may have heard of him, utilitarian philosopher, an atheist, I guess, or agnostic at least. Most of his support, financial support, came from Jews, Jewish businessmen, so that their children could actually go to a university. So that's the secular, and it was called, the University College London, quite famous, was called the Godless College. Now, let's take another area of the world, and we can observe the persistence of exactly the same issue in, of all places, Russia, which had from the 1790s to the 1930s, the largest Jewish population. There were severe educational barriers in Russia. Even when Jews were allowed to go to university in the late 19th century, Tsar Alexander III introduced a policy that only a tiny percentage of Jews could enter. After 1917, the Communist Revolution, large numbers of Jews enrolled in universities, professors, research workers, etc. However, during the black years of Stalin, 48 to 53, most of the professors lost their jobs, and they were dismissed from their posts, arrested, and a lot of them were exiled. And when the Soviet Union adopted a policy of anti-Zionism, the anti-Zionist or the Zionist is racism campaign in the 1970s, mostly over the battle of immigration to Israel, prestigious academic institutions like Moscow State University introduced a 2% quota for Jewish students. And it's a kind of irony that Soviet President Leonid Brezhnev reintroduces the policy of Alexander III on restricting Jewish entrance to university. And it also meant that, obviously, communist international brotherhood and solidarity was questionable under a system that could allow that. In other states with large Jewish populations or Jewish communities, similar constraints operated. In the 1920s, Poland, Hungary, and Romania introduced what they called the numerus clausus, which is quota system, to limit the Jewish student enrollment. In Poland, particularly, all the Jewish students were relegated to what they called ghetto benches. They all had to sit together in the lecture halls on their own benches, while periodic riots were organized by anti-Semitic students against them. And what of the United States? In 1905, there were the Harvard University, one of the Ivy Leagues, introduced for the first time merit tests to get into the university. But apparently too many Jews passed the tests. So the president, Lowell, introduced what he called quality issues or quality standards. And the two standards that the two issues or the two qualities that people had to have was character and manliness, whatever those mean. And of course, he was able, and his friends were able to exclude most of the Jews on the basis that they didn't have much character, and they certainly didn't have much manliness. In 1922, even though this was not working very well, he introduced actually a 10% quota for Jews by expressing concern that the Jews do not mix and they destroy the unity of the college. So that's America. In 1945, as late as 1945, Dartmouth College president E.M. Hopkins justified a quota for Jewish students by emphasizing that Dartmouth, as we know, is a Christian college founded for the Christianization of students. Therefore, they could exclude Jews. In 1947, President Truman's Commission on Higher Education charged that quota systems and policies of exclusion had prevented young people of many religious and racial groups, particularly Jews and blacks, from obtaining higher education and professional training. A study by the American Council on Education in 1949 showed that the average Jewish applicant for college had considerably less chance of acceptance than a Catholic or Protestant of comparable scholastic ability. In the same year, application forms from 518 colleges and universities and 88 schools of medicine and dentistry were still found to contain at least one and unusually several potentially discriminatory questions, such as what is your religion and some other questions like that. Even after Jews were admitted in most countries, there remained, of course, the next barrier, not just for students, but for hiring Jewish faculty. Now, obviously, we then have to turn to Germany for the, kind of the ultimate system of discrimination and exclusion. But the point, of course, about Germany is that Germany was the basis. The German university system was the basis on which most Western universities followed. And that is the idea of a research university with research institutions and doctoral programs. But however, already in the 19th century, you had problems with German intellectuals. The greatest German historian of his age, Heinrich von Treitschke, was professor of history at the University of Berlin, in 1879 recoined and endorsed the slogan, "Die Juden sind unser Unglück," the Jews are our misfortune, which was first used by Martin Luther in the 1500s. Now, von Treitschke died in 1896, but his ideas lived on. 50 years later, this identical phrase used by professor became the banner of the Nazi newspaper, Der Stürmer, in order to inspire Hitler's stormtroopers. Now, if you're postmodernist, I guess you would regard such things as coincidence. Some of us would not. Now, in 1922, the famous German economist and sociologist Max Weber wrote an essay, Wissenschaft als Beruf, Science as a Vocation. Here he put his finger on something that would come to fruition 10 years later when Hitler came to power. One of the major reasons for the eventual displacement of the scholar by the Nazi demagogue as proponents of academic values and goals. Without reference to the Nazis or any other party, Weber revealed how the values void arose, which would permit totalitarian dictators and other fanatics to get control of a university. In the late 1920s, during the years of the Weimar Republic, German university students began to harass Jewish students and put pressure on Jewish professors, preparing for the repression of the Nazi regime. And it's important to realize that the Nazis party controlled the universities, both the student unions and the faculty clubs, before it controlled the streets or the government. In the 1920s, there was continued demand for the removal of Jews from the German Studentbond Federation, I guess, Deutsche Studentenschaft. This evidence shows that the majority of students supported at least a drastic reduction in the number of Jewish students at institutions of higher learning. Now, I've given you a reference to Bender's book, which talks about the trahison, the treason of the clerics, of the intellectuals. But it's also important that people who, like Leonard, who was a famous Nobel Prize winner, a physicist, he said that Jews, he was the one who originated the idea of Jewish physics, that certain portions of physics were controlled by Jews and certain things shouldn't be studied, which differed from German physics. Well, there's a Nobel Prize winner saying there's a Jewish physics and a German physics. Similar views were held by Johannes Stark, the zoologist Galt, the theologian Hirsch, the art historian Pinder, surgeon Sauerbruch, and countless other German.
Uh-oh. Ira, help.
Barry, let's see.
You call him?
Yeah, I'll give him a call.
See, ladies and gentlemen, this is anti-Semitism right here. That was a joke. So while we wait, I see Daphne found some of the lyrics from the J Electronica new album produced by Jay-Z. I urge everybody to listen to the lyrics. Oh, and by the way, so in the course handout, you're requested to watch this film called 24 Days. So I urge you to watch it. It starts off a bit kitschy, but the film actually gets, I think, quite good. And it shows it's based on a true story about Ilan Halemi, who was kidnapped and murdered in France. So you can sort of see the issues of contemporary anti-Semitism being played out and sort of the denial of the establishment to really deal with it. So, get a chance.
Okay, can I carry on?
Okay, good.
All right, I was with Heidegger. Heidegger was arguing that the revolution, the complete revolution of German existence, they said, National Socialist Revolution is not merely the taking over an already existing power in the state by another party, but this revolution means a complete revolution in our German existence. Heil Hitler. Heidegger and 8 of his colleagues published an oath of allegiance of the professors of the German universities and high schools to Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist state. And that began the cleansing process of German universities. Began in April 33, they brought in regulations. By 1934-35, they dismissed about 1,150 Jewish professors, or what they called non-Aryans. So it took them about 18 months to do that. In 32, there were 4,000 Jewish students at German universities. By 1934-35, there were 800 left. And the following year, there were 0 Jewish students left at German universities. Now, the interesting thing here, of course, is that the very few people in Europe actually complained about it. There were no boycotts of German universities by Western universities. Now, I'll give another example. March 1938, the Nazis took over Austria and incorporated it into the Third Reich. 3 weeks later, 150 Jewish professors were dismissed from the University of Vienna Medical School. Now, that, of course, affected large numbers of patients, but nobody cared. It was more interested to cleanse the university of its Jewish medical faculty than worry about the patients they were treating. So there were no protests or faculty strikes against this race policy by universities in Britain, Scandinavia. In fact, the refugee scholars from Europe who'd been sacked, including Albert Einstein, found themselves excluded from tenured posts. Ivy League presidents, like Lowell in Harvard, actually hosted visiting Nazi dignitaries. Now, why did they do this? America's top universities and medical schools themselves were operating Jewish quotas. So presumably they don't feel very confident at criticizing Germany. So what it shows is that there was a fashionable and endemic Western intellectuals, anti-Semitism amongst Western intellectuals well into the 20th century. It was only in the 1960s that Jewish academics began to take tenured positions in Ivy League universities. And that's not difficult, as I showed, to explain, because universities are the home of elite privilege. And these were originally, even the Ivy Leagues in the United States were originally Christian foundations. So it's very important to realize that and one should not be surprised, given this history, that there are strident calls amongst academics today for a boycott of Israeli universities and scholars, and campaigns for divestment from Israel by universities. But let's go back to, that's the how, but what about the why? Right? The why is that universities, of course, are the clearinghouse for entry, as I've said, into the professions, into positions of power and prestige in society. You can't get on and make it into the
So I was talking to you about the film. Okay. Barry.
I'll give him a call.
Are you going to call him?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about this.
Do you want me to just?
I hope is he going to dial back in, or he's totally gone, I think.
Okay. Here, well, just gotta put it on speaker. We'll see how this works.
Okay.
So let me just finish by saying that universities are the breeding ground, not only for ideas, good ideas and bad ideas. And anybody who thinks the universities are divorced from the problems of the rest of society and they're ivory towers lives in cloud cuckoo land. They're part and parcel of the system. And it's important to realize that they've produced one of the issues I think we have to look about is the social psychological one or the developed one. All the violent revolutionaries of the last 200 years have come out of universities. Fascists, Marxists, Islamists, they're overwhelmingly young adults, but they're usually quite well-educated people. They're the ones who populate the universities. That's why Mussolini's fascist anthem was Giovinezza, meaning youth. Today, it's interesting, you come back to UK government figures. 47% of the convicted terrorists in Britain since 2001 attended university, and 6 convicted terrorist presidents of their Islamic society. I think that gives you an idea of the psychological, social, political system that operates in universities. They are places where people can discuss with other people, and you can get a lot of interaction and the creation of groups and the spreading of ideas. Obviously, this was mostly today what we see happening on social media used to happen in university clubs and bars and things like that. So I think that it's important to realize that the university has acted as a mechanism for not only Jewish advancement, and we hear a lot about social mobility, but also to in very destructive ways of the Jewish advancement, socially, politically, and economically. So I'll leave it there, and obviously we can discuss that later.
Okay, Barry, thank you very much. I hope you can dial in back to Zoom. And Barry, thanks for your words, and I hope you can come onto Zoom for the Q&A.
We've had a big storm here, so our electricity goes sometimes anyway.
Okay. So Barry, what I would like to do, I'll give my talk, and then we can do a Q&A when I'm finished together.
Yes, okay. Well, if I'm not on the Zoom, just give me a call back, okay?
Okay, I think Ira will do that.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Barry, maybe stay on the line then, if you can. Okay. All right, so I'm going to speak briefly. So the title of my talk is Globalization, a Crisis of Modernity. And what I would like to discuss is sort of how anti-Semitism is being studied in academia. So first of all, as I said in my welcoming remarks, there really is not, academia has not been open significantly to the study of contemporary anti-Semitism. So despite the long legacy and history in Western civilization and thought of anti-Semitism, as I spoke briefly last night, sort of the 3 phases, the religious phase, the racist phase, and the current phase of anti-Semitisms that attack notions of Jewish peoplehood. Despite this long legacy in the religion, in the social science, even in the science, the fact that anti-Semitism studies doesn't really exist in and of itself, I think, should be a research project of why this is so. Which is interesting. So it's not really on the map. And unlike the study, I think, of racism, race relations, gender studies, queer studies, there is not really a school of critical contemporary anti-Semitism studies that has a framework, that has a systematic analysis or framework to understand manifestations and processes associated with contemporary anti-Semitism. And I would think, in a sense, most of the work on anti-Semitism, particularly in the contemporary context, I would argue is quite descriptive and doesn't really take place in a sort of analytical framework. So I think it's really urgently required. And what is fascinating to me in the discourse of religious anti-Semitism, of racist anti-Semitism, and the contemporary attack on who Jews are as a people, I think that Jews are the only group in the enlightened academic circles that are continuously defined against the will of who Jews are as a people, always. Defined not according to the Jewish religion, certainly not according to Jewish notions of who Jews are as a people. There's no such thing as race in Judaism and Jewish thought. That's a European colonial invention. And certainly Jewish notions of peoplehood, our connection to the land of Israel, of being indigenous to the land. We know this from the Torah, we know this from the New Testament, we know this from the Quran, we know this from history, and that through the state of Israel, and through Zionism, how Jews established themselves a self-determination on part of their homeland. And this is now defined, and sort of Jews are being demonized in the most pernicious form as being racist, colonialist, occupationists, pinkwashing, the list goes on and on. So for young Jewish scholars, I think, as Barry was saying, in the academic world, for faculty and students to have an allegiance with a fascist, apartheid, colonial, occupying, pinkwashing, racist entity requires a little bit of chutzpah in this sort of intellectual environment. And I find it amazing that educated people still have the gall to define the other, to put the Jew into some sort of box, a racist box, a colonial box, a Netanyahu box, the list goes on and on. Whereas enlightened people, educated people, I don't think in certain circles would be permitted to define other people that way. And I certainly hope they wouldn't, but yet Jews are. I think drawing on what Akiva was saying, so what we're trying to do at ISGAP is create sort of a framework, an analytical framework to understand processes connected to anti-Semitism. I think David Patterson, there's a few of us, Suni Ali, who I see was here. We have a reading group, which other people are welcome to join us after the summer school, and we read different texts. So last 2 weeks ago, we were reading Emmanuel Levinas and how he brought Jewish education to Western universities after the Holocaust. Emmanuel Levinas was one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. He came originally from Lithuania. He was doing his PhD in France when the Holocaust broke out, when the Second World War started. His family were annihilated, exterminated, murdered by the Nazis, and he survived because he was in France. And he brings Jewish thought and Jewish ethics to the university for the first time. So in a sense, he's a pioneer because it's not just a Jewish ethnic person learning Occidental thought and Western philosophy and fitting into the canon, the Western canon of the university, but he actually tries to bring Jewish thought to the university. And in the article that we read, he was trying to sort of figure out how can the primitive Jew, right, fit into the sort of humanist, enlightened framework of thought, right? Because as a humanist, if you're fitting into humanism, you're supposed to leave and shed your primitive identities and adopt the higher civilization of Western thought, of humanism, to become a member of the academy. And here he was trying to take this primitive thought, I'm being a little bit facetious, and he was as well, into the university. And I think one of the most amazing things to me, and this is a whole, you can write many books on this subject, but what Levinas does is he brings Pirkei Avot, he brings Jewish ethics and Jewish thought to the university. And some of the most, I think, important and famous things, this phone is ringing. I think Barry's calling me now. I hung up on him. Sorry, Barry. So what Levinas brings to the university, he tries to bring Jewish ethics and Jewish thought. And in Jewish ethics and thought, as Akiva was explaining in the opening address, in his, I think, his fine, inspiring talk, was how in Judaism, and what Emmanuel Levinas was saying is that we need the other to be human. And what Emmanuel Levinas would argue is that when you see your face in the face of the other, when you see your face in the face of the other, that's the instant you become human. So in Jewish thought, we need the other to be human. So there is a whole series of ethics that must be in place to govern our behavior, our understanding, and our treatment, and our perception of the other, because we need the other to be human. We need the other to be ethical. We need the other to gain wisdom. Because if everybody's created in the image of God, everybody has a truth. And in order to become wise, you have to be open to other people's truths. And if I'm racist, I eliminate 1 billion possibilities of being wiser. If I'm sexist, I eliminate 3 or 4 billion opportunities to be wiser. So we need the other to be human. We need the other to get closer, I'd say, to our source. So in a sense, this is very different than Western thought that at best I think has this sort of tolerance of the other. And in Western thought, always this capacity to define the other. And I think that if we're going to create a framework to understand anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination, I really believe that we have to take a step back from our university education and our Western philosophical understanding of the other and take a pause. Because who are we? Who are we to define the other? And imagine if we define the other based on the legacy of Western thought, of racist thought, of sexist thought, of gendered thought, and the list goes on and on. So I think these type of stereotypes that exist in Western thought are no longer acceptable in certain spaces, and rightly so. And I think we always have to, listen to our language, listen to our perceptions of space, of time, of the city, right? To understand how these processes of segregation are all around us, and we have to be conscious of how we define the other. And I think now, when it comes to anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, for the scholars who are not from the Jewish community, first of all, it's wonderful that you're here and you're interested in this subject. But I think you have to realize that the Jewish community in the United States of America, the Jewish community in Canada, the Jewish community throughout South America, throughout Europe, and certainly in other parts of the world, have this sense of being under siege, they're being under siege from white supremacy, from nationalism, the sort of the right-wing anti-Semitism, from political Islam, as David Patterson so eloquently laid out for us in a short period of time, this amalgamation of European anti-Semitism and even Nazism that is the ideological foundation. It's not the periphery, it's the foundation of political Islam, of the Muslim Brotherhood, of the Iranian revolutionary regime. And how in this intellectual moment of post-modernity, of intersectionality, that this intellectual philosophical movement has sort of this, I call it the Red-Green Alliance, which I don't think adequately describes it, but this sort of intellectual moment where Zionism and Jewish peoplehood is really at the front, if you will, of this sort of anti-Semitic intellectual onslaught against the Jewish people. So you have this Red-Green Alliance, and you have the emergence of white supremacy, and and as well in the United States of America, in this moment of fragmentation and of crisis, of police brutality, of murdering African American citizens, of a community, of an African American community under siege, literally under siege, feeling very insecure and feared. There's progressive voices emanating from this moment of crisis, and there are also anti-Semitic voices coming out of this crisis. And it's not just the Nation of Islam. It's in, Louis Farrakhan and Sunni Ali will speak to this, I believe, on his lecture on Thursday. It's a part of hip hop culture, it's not only hip hop culture, there's a consciousness to it, but there are these voices, soldiers of Louis Farrakhan in hip hop culture and among journalists and athletes, which is really putting the Jewish community under stress in the United States and beyond. So these are very serious issues. So why is this happening? So I think what I'm interested in doing in trying to understand anti-Semitism is to put it into a interdisciplinary analytical framework to understand this in the context of economic, political, social, cultural processes. And what I do in my work is try to trace this to notions of how globalization and neoliberalism is impacting on cultural identity, and to put it into sort of that framework, sort of borrowing from the work of the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, Stuart Hall, and others who put issues of cultural studies, of issues of race, racism, identity, cultural identity on the map, and looking at how social cultural policy impacts on national identity and notions of otherness. And this is what I did my doctorate in, looking at social theory from colonial times to multicultural times and how notions of belonging and otherness were constructed. So that's sort of my background. And what I find interesting is that we're living in this sort of what I call this crisis of modernity. And you have, after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, the emergence of the United Nations, of international organizations, and this sort of modernist identity of what the state ought to be. The state became this mechanism for modernization, of growing the economy, of developing society economically, politically, and culturally. And people develop strong identities affiliated or associated with the state. So in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, modernity was very much linked to the power of the state, and that the state was this modernizing force within society. And what I look at is the emergence of neoliberalism, of structural adjustment, and how the IMF and the World Bank and the G7 countries impose structural adjustment on developing countries, and also introduce free market mechanisms in industrial advanced countries, in Europe, in North America, and in other countries. And how the social theory, how the policy, the economic and political models that were being developed for modernity understood that if you weaken the power of the state and allow free market enterprise to enter into society, there'll be more freedom and more economic development. So you weaken the state and you allow free markets to develop society. And what we witnessed at the beginning in parts of Africa, in parts of the Middle East, you see the beginning of the collapse of states. The state is so weakened that actually states fail. Sudan, Syria, states begin to fail. And as the states fail, there's a fragmentation of cultural identity. And this is part, I would argue, of the sort of neoliberal globalization model. So as the states are weakened, identities fragment. So you have neoliberals arguing for a weakening of the state, and you have political Islamists in the Middle East seeing the state as a vestige of Western imperialism and colonialism. They want to destroy the state. They don't want to weaken it, they want to destroy it. So as neoliberalism pushes back from developing and supporting the state, these vacuums are now being filled by political Islam, which David Patterson so aptly describes. So these reactionary social forces fill the vacuum. So globalization at one level should be understood as well. I get into this in my article, which I asked you to read, is that there's this notion of time-space compression. So the more time and space that we could occupy, the more space, and the faster we go, the more globalized we are. That means that we are on the implementing side of globalization. So people, scholars who are kind of, I don't know, upper middle class Western intellectuals, we get to travel around the world at a certain pace. if you are at the Silicon Valley or in Delhi or in Tel Aviv or wherever the high-tech industries are, you move around capital and trade at a much faster rate. So the more globalized you are, the more on the initiating side of globalization, the faster you are in this sort of process of globalization. When you're on the receiving side of globalization, you're stuck in time and you're stuck in space. And more people are being marginalized economically, socially, and culturally in this process. So this was the sort of the book that we created here, Global Anti-Semitism, A Crisis of Modernity, looking at the reemergence of anti-Semitism as there was this crisis of capitalism, of this crisis of modernity. So you see this beginning in the Middle East, and you see in the civil war in Syria, where reactionary social forces, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, the Muslim Brotherhood, other forms of political Islam, not Islam, but political Islam, you see that use anti-Semitism at the core of its reactionary ideology, engage in this sort of revolutionary movement that actually kills their fellow brothers and sisters who are Muslim, that results in an ongoing genocide in Syria and Iraq, where over 1 million people were murdered, right? Murdered over 6-7 years. More than 15 million refugees in Syria and Iraq displaced, moving into places like Turkey and later into Europe. So this sort of breakdown of Middle Eastern societies sort of emerging. You have the flow of refugees into Turkey. Erdogan, also connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, the head of the prime minister in Turkey, now sort of taking the mantelpiece of the Muslim Brotherhood in the region. He turns the tap on and off of migration into Europe, into Greece. We saw the crisis into Germany. And now we see not only the economic crisis in Europe affecting society in a deep way, you see the emergence of nationalism as a reaction to these refugees coming into Europe. So as these states are fragmenting and failing because of the crisis of capital or the crisis of neoliberal globalization, you see the emergence of nationalism in Europe as a reaction to the refugee crisis of Muslim immigrants. And you also begin to see sort of the rise of nationalism in the United States and xenophobia and an increase of racist rhetoric as well. So this crisis of modernity, of capital, where anti-systemic, sort of reactionary social movements are gaining strength, using anti-Semitism as a core element of its ideology, we see these problems being exacerbated on a global level, where anti-Semitism and the Jew is stuck in the middle. So it's astounding that, to me, that people could define Zionism and Israel in such a way when there's a genocide happening just miles away from Jerusalem. And the intellectual community, by and large, has remained silent. So why have we, as a community of scholars and intellectuals, turned a blind eye to this horrific ongoing tragedy throughout much of the world in the academy? Why do we focus on the Jew when this catastrophe is happening in the region? And I think I'm thinking of Ruth Weiss, who wrote a very important book on notions of Jewish power. And, she was explaining very eloquently sort of the rise of Nazism. So the Nazis would focus on the Jew, focus on the Jew. The Jew is corrupt. The Jew is evil. The Jew is the wrong religion. The Jew is corrupting the banks and the Hollywood and focus on the Jew. But over here, the Nazis were taking over and taking power and creating this reactionary revolution. And it's not dissimilar. The intellectual environment has been telling us and teaching us, focus on the Jew, the modern day Jew, the Zionist, the Israeli, Likud, Netanyahu, Sharon, focus on those Zionists. And while we're focusing on those Zionists, there's genocide taking place, and reactionary social movements that are diametrically opposed to what we all believe in here. Regardless if you're conservative or liberal or slightly religious or somewhat religious or secular, I'm convinced that everybody on this call would agree with the notion that everybody, regardless of our race, religion, gender, wealth, should be equal under one legal system. This is what democratic principles, basic notions of citizenship are. You should be equal under the law. And yet, here is this reactionary social movement sweeping the Islamic world, sweeping now into Turkey, sweeping into our universities. Our universities, by the way, one of the research projects that we've done at ISGAP is looking at the Muslim Brotherhood funding of American universities and the impact this has had on anti-Semitism in the best universities of the United States. In our research project, we found over $3 billion that have been given to the top 10 universities in the United States of America by the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists. So these are anti-Semitic, but they're also sexist, they're also homophobic, they're also anti-democratic. And yet we collectively turn a blind eye because it's the Zionists, the racists, the modern day apartheid incarnation. So here, just like the time of the Nazis, and I'm choosing my words carefully, ladies and gentlemen, just like the times of the Nazis, we collectively not only are incapable of understanding and analyzing contemporary anti-Semitism, we focus on the contemporary Jew, the Zionist and the Israeli, while our democratic principles have gone to hell. And we're living in this globalized community. We're now on the internet communicating with people in, I don't know, over 20 countries today from around the world. And we don't understand that Hamas, which controls Gaza and part of the Palestinian Authority, the Muslim Brotherhood that is supporting, controlling swaths of territory in what was Iraq and Syria, because Iraq and Syria essentially don't even exist anymore. They've been so fragmented. Those are old maps that we're looking at. That these reactionary forces are controlling these spaces, and we're not able to focus on the implications of this, and we turn a blind eye to it, and we don't engage in it, and we don't even, in a sense, I think, understand how these views in this time of the flow of information is so quick that we think that we're going to be protected in places like Oxford, or we're going to be protected in the United States and in Canada, when these ideologies are fluid and they're moving at the speed of the internet. And they're in our universities, they're in our communities, they're in our political culture as we speak. They're in the halls of Congress, the Islamists and the racists. They're in our universities. So I think, as Elie Wiesel said, that anti-Semitism begins with the Jews, but it doesn't end with the Jews. And this crisis is not a parochial Jewish problem. It's not a problem of the Israelis or the Zionists. It's a problem for anybody who really cares about democratic principles and the basic notion of being equal under one legal system and not allowing old forms of hatreds with an S to reemerge and to enter into our political discourse and into our lives once again. And tragically, in this fragmented moment, where I think we've abandoned basic notions of citizenship and social democracy and access to education and access to healthcare and access to goods and services and decent employment, we're just entering into this very reactionary moment of fragmenting and of identity. And I think Emmanuel Castells rightly argued that when people start to fight over identity, that's the last space that's left in a society where economic and political and social pressure, spaces, policies have been removed from the lives of people. When people become increasingly marginalized, they focus on their identity because that's the last terrain that they can protect. So when white supremacists are emerging, when the Nation of Islam and this replacement theory and that's kind of emerging or in a powerful way in the United States, still on the margins, but it's emerging. The discourse has emerged. We have to understand this in a critical framework that, you know, when people are marginalized and brutalized, they turn to these reactionary identities. These reactionary ideologies give people very easy answers in times of fear, in times of insecurity. So I'll leave it there, but I think, you know, just to sum up in a sentence that, again, the study of anti-Semitism is not a parochial problem. It's the canary in the coal mine. It's the early warning system to democratic principles. And I think as scholars and intellectuals, it's high time that we begin to really, you know, take a step back from the prejudicial discourse when it comes to the Jew, the religious Jew, the racialized Jew, or the nationalized Jew, and really begin to unpack what's taking place before our eyes in real time, the sort of emergence of reactionary politics, and how can we, as enlightened, educated people who believe in basic democratic principles, what can we do to sort of map, decode, and create approaches to solve this crisis? So I'll leave it there. And I think Barry and I hope Barry's back on the line. We can take some questions and comments. Thank you.
Barry should be back as well. Yeah. Just need to unmute yourself, Barry.
You know, so what I can do, Barry, are you with us?
I'm coming.
Oh, yeah, we hear you. Oh, no. I think Barry's with Joel's connection. Are you with Joel?
Hello?
I think you're okay now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you well. Welcome back.
Good.
Okay, so we'll take some.
You know, we've had a very large storm. It's knocked down 50% of the town doesn't have electricity. I didn't have it yesterday.
A summer storm. Okay, so welcome back, Barry. So we can take some questions.
And if I could just chime in, and there's a feature you should all have to raise your hand. I can't see it as a host, but Daphne, could you just explain where they can locate it?
Yeah, so if everybody clicks on the participant tab, it should say participants 58. When you click on it, a menu is going to pop up and there's a feature saying raise hand.
Cool. I see it. Okay, so I see Chloe, you have a question. Go ahead. Now I hear
Hi.
Hi, Chloe.
Thank you so much. I believe really strongly in these issues, so it's very refreshing to be part of this community of thinkers, like really interrogating the nature of anti-Semitism in academia. So just want to say that's really great. Just 2 points about the triangulation between anti-Semitism, modernity, and academia. The first one is in terms of the discussion of anti-Semitism within postmodern and post-structuralist thought, the figures like Foucault and Said have been mentioned. I would also argue that alongside that, there has been a very rich and vibrant tradition of interrogating anti-Semitism from Jewish thinkers as well, and within post-structuralist critical theoretical frameworks. So obviously the Frankfurt School, but also Derrida, Kristeva, Cixous, and they have a lot to contribute to the study of the Jew being othered within post-structuralist frameworks to do with fragmentation and excess from dominant structures. So I think that anti-Semitism as a critical study extends also not only within like the explicit Israeli-Palestinian kind of dimension, but as the figure of the Jew as an abstract figure is interrogated consistently as well in Western intellectual thought. I think that's kind of an interesting dimension. And my second point would be about the nature of particular institutions in the climate and setting the coordinates for conversations in classrooms. So for example, I'm at Cambridge, and the main way of approaching material and texts is through practical criticism from 1929, and it's essentially taking texts and extracting it from all political or any sort of historical background and looking at it as a self-functioning piece, which means that any sort of role that these texts have to play in networks of racism, oppression, anti-Semitism are completely erased. And this is the way that students are taught every single day in my faculty right now. So I would just be interested if you had any thoughts about the study of the Jew as other within post-structuralist thought and how that plays into these sorts of questions, and also particular institutions and their own identity and the work that they produce as well.
It's a great point. Barry, do you want to speak to it, or should I? Barry's frozen again. All right, so Chloe, you make some very important points. Yeah, so could you repeat the last part of your question? So the nature of the institutions?
So the identity of particular institutions in determining the work and the study that is produced, and also the particular grammar that they provide for their students to interrogate structures of oppression. So yeah, particular institutional identities. And then my first question was on abstract ideas of the Jew throughout history, throughout theory. Okay,
so they're very good points. So I agree with you that the Frankfurt School could be very informative, and as well as Jacques Derrida to an extent. I go more to Emmanuel Levinas for my inspiration, but I agree with you. And I think your observations, the way issues of anti-Semitism and racism are kind of decontextualized by the educational framework that we're in, is important. I think what Levinas tried to do by bringing Jewish education to the university and Jewish ethics to the university is really important. And our reading group that David Patterson and Suni is involved with a few other colleagues, we were also reading Stephen Biko. And I think Biko also tries to bring, in his writings through Black consciousness, tries to bring African wisdom into the university. So, again, in South Africa, Black Africans or Africans, indigenous Africans, in order for them to go into the university, to enter into the university, they had to also leave, like the Jews, their primitive culture behind, in quotations, I'm being facetious, and adopt the higher culture of Western thought that's being taught in the universities. So I think where some of some of my interest is, how do we bring the wisdom, the wisdom and the knowledge of the other or the others into the conversation in a real way, not to objectify them on really superficial, to objectify, to label, to categorize people in such a superficial way, be they Africans, be they indigenous people of the Americas, and be they Jews. So how do we begin to understand the wisdom and knowledge of the other? I think that has to be an important part of it in terms of understanding anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred. And then also trying to sort of locate this in the sort of what I would consider the processes of globalization, socioeconomic, cultural processes that impact the way we live, where we live, how we live, who our neighbors are, who do we communicate with. We may communicate with people in Oxford or Cambridge more readily than we do, people a mile away from our home through the tools that we have, air travel, or telecommunications and the internet. So time, space, who do we connect with and how that impacts on our societies and our knowledge. So yeah, so expanding our sources of knowledge and locating them in this sort of socioeconomic and cultural reality in the material sense, and how that informs where people are, how they're categorized, and where they're located. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Barry, are you here to say anything?
We're still without Barry.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to take another question in the meanwhile. Is anybody, Ira, do you see anybody else hands up?
Zebnik.
Okay. Zebnik?
Yeah, thank you very much. But unfortunately, my question was directed to Barry, who is not with us today. So I will yield.
Actually,
I wanted to ask him about the numbers, about the percentage of, as he said, terrorists or attackers with university degrees. I was interested to know more about where are these numbers coming from. Perhaps if he could share the source, perhaps send it to us by email or share it in the chat.
Okay, I think you're going to, can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you well.
Now we can.
Okay. They are British government sources, but the best place to get this kind of thing is from Gilliam organization. One of your speakers is, what's his name? Charles,
Harris,
you know who I'm
Harris
talking about.
The Quilliam Foundation that's based in London.
William, yeah.
Yeah. I would be interested to see more about the data. What is the sample? Like, what kind of sample are we dealing with here? In which countries and things like that? It's because it's very fascinating. But when I want to mention that number somewhere,
let me just say, it's not a sample. It's it's the number of perpetrators, and they look at their backgrounds and found how many went to university. The famous case also of in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where 6 people carried out a university students from Britain. It's they look at what are the origins of these people. It's not samples. It's not a survey. It's actually evidence-based.
Okay. Would it be possible to share the study or something like that?
Well, you can get it from Quilliam.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for the lecture. It was fascinating. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. So we'll also, Harris Rafiq will be here, and he'll be speaking with Rami Aziz, and they'll get into it in more detail. Famously, Daniel Pearl's killer was a graduate of the LSE as a case in point. Ira, do you see any more questions?
Yes, from Seth.
Cool. Hello, Seth.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for very fascinating lectures. And my question was to Barry about what were the factors that led to the opening up of British universities like Oxford and Cambridge to Jews in the 19th century? Was this opening brought about by the Enlightenment and the emancipation of European Jewry that was going on throughout the 19th century, or were there other more benevolent or generous factors that spurred these universities to open?
Well, obviously it was part of the emancipation process. In Britain, the situation usually was that, first of all, they allow in, you have to understand the Protest Acts. First of all, you had members of the Church of England. Everything was restricted exclusively to them. Then you had what they called the dissenters, Protestant dissenters, the nonconformists. People were open, the positions in public life and the voting and things like that was open to them. And then to Catholics after the 1830s. First, and then you had Catholic students entering Oxford, and then the Jews. And the process is the same one of the in European countries. Usually, but in Britain, it's usually Anglicans, then nonconformists, then Catholics, then Jews, and then eventually atheists. And with atheists, the issue was giving them places in public life was the whole issue of could they swear on a Bible. So that is it. I mean, all of these things are taking oaths. That's how you restrict things. Catholics can't take an oath on the Protestant Bible. Jews can't take an oath on the Christian Bible. Atheists won't take an oath on the Bible. They will have to, what is the word I'm trying to think, affirm the truth. And so that was the way in which you restricted people. Allow anybody to affirm or use a Quran or whatever it is, you open up these positions. But they usually are based on taking some kind of oath on a sacred text.
Thanks, Barry. I see that Carlton has a question. Dr. Long.
Just need to
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Charles and Barry. It's really more just like a quick statement than kind of a question. The quick statement is something that I posted. Charles, as you were speaking, I was just reminded, and I made a note on the side that, you know, it's amazing. We're in our 6th year, and, you know, Charles, you and I have had sidebars, I think, each year since 2015. And each year we've said, this is worse than last year. I think, you know, that's worth our noting in terms of the critical moment that we're in. We have felt, I think, collectively aggrieved and worried. And each year, I think we have felt that things have inched along, and sometimes not always inched, but leapt along in the wrong direction globally. So that was just a sidebar. The other thing is that really this is very practical. I'm thinking really in my role as a pedagogical director, but I thought this might be a good time to hop in, Charles and Barry, and ask you both, especially given the topic of both of your conversations today. This might be a good time. I guess, could you give us just like one takeaway that you would offer to the scholars and residents, and also to the Wiesel King scholars as they're thinking about their projects? They're thinking, as the scholars are thinking about their syllabi, because we want them to continue to move along and be able to finish the week with some kind of rough draft. And the same thing for the Wiesel King. So given your talk, is there something that you would extract from it that you say, hey, carry this with you as you're thinking about your syllabi, if you will. Carry this with you, Wiesel Kings, as you're thinking about your project. And I guess I toss that up to each of you.
Thanks, Carlton. Barry, you here?
Well, what I think you have to realize that we're dealing with a disciplinary situation, a disciplinary subject. We have to think about the interconnectedness of these things. I mean, the most interesting thing is, what I also believe is that just as you say things are getting worse, they're getting worse because they're cumulative. I've tried to explain that anti-Semitism is an additive. None of the old prejudices or the old arguments fall away. New arguments are added to them, and anybody at any time can go into that cafeteria and grab any of them. So you get people from sort of suddenly resurrecting kind of arguments from the Middle Ages, suddenly in 20th century industrial Europe. So I think to me, that's the issue. The issue is the power of ideas. And that's why we're talking about university. Good ideas and bad ideas come out. You know, the old aphorism is the jungle is neutral. Nature is neutral. It's like, you know, you get wonderful, beautiful butterflies, but you also get earthquakes with nature. And I think that's what we're talking about here. Ideas. We're in the realm of ideas, and they can be malevolent and they can be wonderfully enlightening.
Thanks, Barry. And Carlton, in response to your point and question, things are definitely shifting, and they're becoming more acute in the 6 short years that we've been doing this. But also, if we go back further, and I'm going to date myself now, but in the 1990s, when we were hanging out in the early 1990s, when we were in Oxford, dealing with issues of apartheid and Soviet Jewry and Ethiopian Jewry and multiculturalism, we were winning. Things were getting better. The struggle was meeting with success. So if we go back 20, 25 years, we're getting better, and not just look at the last 6 years when things are getting worse. I think in that context, it's even more stark, the situation that we're in. So I think it's very serious. And as Elie Wiesel said in 2003, we're living in a time of a great emergency. And from 2003 to 2020, things have not improved. Things are getting worse in many ways. And I think for the students working on a project, I would say that it's very important to understand the landscape in your university, to understand the academic landscape, not only among the intellectuals, the intellectual landscape, but the political landscape. The Students for Justice in Palestine that has popped up at universities around the Western world, in Europe, and particularly in the United States, where there's hundreds of chapters. The Students for Justice of Palestine comes out of the Muslim Student Association. The Muslim Student Association is the Muslim Brotherhood. It's the Muslim Brotherhood. Students for Justice in Palestine is the Muslim Brotherhood. So students need to be aware of the ideologies that they're confronting. So when the Students for Justice in Palestine / the Muslim Brotherhood says that, you know, from the river to the sea, you know, who's saying that? They've been saying that, you know, for 100 years. David Patterson shows that they've been saying that, you know, during the Holocaust and in the aftermath of the Holocaust. This is who they are. So as scholars and as researchers, we have to be aware of the landscape. And then if we're going to build projects to deal with that landscape, once we understand the landscape, I hope and I think our projects could be more impactful and more significant. So understand your environment and the actors in your environment.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Carlton.
Thank you.
Stephen Stern. Stephen, are you there?
Just need to unmute Stephen.
There we go. Sorry, guys. Can you hear me now?
From San Francisco, it's pretty nice.
Okay. So yeah. Oh, well, let me cover my face. I've got a hat on and I look like a mess. I just want to add to what Charles and Carlton said. Last year, you know, I'm on the left, as you could tell from yesterday. And last year, Charles and I had some arguments. And this year, I've seen what he's saying much more on the left and the acute crisis that we're in. I witness a lot of anti-Semitism on the left. It's becoming a real challenge. And I was talking to Charles about how I need help in addressing it. And last summer, I was completely just like, it's on the right. We have to focus on the right, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just want to double down on what Carlton and Charles have just said. That's it.
Thanks, Stephen. So yeah, so that's why I think putting all of this into a conceptual analytical framework is helpful, because it's not whether we're left or right, religious or secular. We have to look at the social movements and the ideology. And I think we have to promote inclusion and democratic or social democratic principles.
Can I say one more thing? I actually wanted to read a little quote from David Nuremberg to show how serious this is. He writes, anti-Semitism.
Stephen, tell everybody what David Nuremberg is. Important.
Okay, David Nuremberg is a scholar of Judaism at the University of Chicago. He's arguably the smartest Jewish scholar in the United States, and he wrote a monumental work in 2014 called Anti-Judaism, in which he demonstrates quite explicitly and easily and clearly that Western civilization is built upon the erasure or absenting of Judaism. And it's one of the reasons I said yesterday, it's why we don't learn anything about it in our schools at all. It's one of the reasons why when you show up, you don't know what anti-Semitism is and why we don't understand. And I just thought I'd read it from an interview of his, a quick little passage here. Anti-Semitism is distinctive in certain ways. One of those ways is that it really does transcend particular political contexts. There aren't a great number of Jews in Hungary or Poland, but thinking about Jews is a crucial part of nationalism or anti-globalization or whatever you want to call it in Hungary and Poland today. And I think that's different from the way most of the other groups you mentioned are used in the world's imagination. This is a really difficult topic to think about, and I would like to think we are each entitled to study our own hate without having to study all the others. But we can see symptoms of a distinction in our own age. I don't think that people in many parts of the world where there aren't Muslim immigrants are thinking centrally about their own society in terms of Islam. And I would say the same might be true of some racial prejudices that are central to the United States, but don't play a very larger role in other societies. But what's curious about anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism is how it can be put to work by many societies that really have nothing to do with living Jews or Judaism. And he goes on to say that the same anti-Semitic tropes used in the Middle Ages are the ones being used today. Jews are conspiring to undermine civilization and take it over, and Jews are in control of the wealth, both of which are completely untrue. And I recommend to everybody to go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's page to watch the 14-minute film they have on the history of anti-Semitism. It will really help explain things. That's it, sorry.
Thank you, Stephen. Actually, Stephen, if you could put the URL into the chat, everybody can see the video.
I'll do that in the chat right now. Okay.
Thank you very much. I see Ellen Cannon.
I think I'd like to suggest another thing that we might consider that can facilitate in our teaching, and that is the utilization of film that are worthy of these unbelievable discussions we've had this far. The other evening, I've had the pleasure of listening to a wonderful lecture by Ruth Wise. And her conclusion was, if you see one film ever, she said, I recommend this film. Now, again, her discussion is exactly on what we're discussing, the role of the intellectual who is silent and who will have the courage to speak. The name of the film is, if all of you will please take it down, Mr. Jones. It is a 2020 film. It takes place in 1933 during the Stalin 5-year plan. And it is the story of the New York Times Pulitzer Prize winner who covers and supports Stalin, and an unknown journalist who goes and tries to get into the Ukraine to cover during the same year the genocide of starvation. It is a transformative film on the role and the complexity of the intellectual and how we participate or really support democracy or non-democratic ideas. It's wonderful and difficult film.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you. And Ruth Weiss is the co-chair of our academic committee, which is a great honor for us. Is there anybody else that would like to say something, question, comment?
Hi, Charles, just to rejoin, thank you so much for mentioning that, Ellen. One of the things that I really will be continuing to talk with everyone about, especially the scholars and residents, is the idea of using what we call RVLs. Not just requiring students to engage in reading. I mean, so often traditionally, we come from a tradition often where professors say, well, this is the reading, right? The reading list, and this is required reading, this is recommended reading. That's a very common construct, certainly in the United States, but I think also globally, very often there's been a focus on the written word. We don't want to dispense with that, of course, obviously the written word. We want to continue to engage students in the written text, such as Nuremberg and many, many others, right? So the written word remains paramount, especially at the university. But at the same time, we're in this new age, as we see right now, as we're engaged in other forms of text, which are texts beyond the written word, what's often called new literacies. So one of the things that we can do as educators, especially those of us who are, say, over 30, right? Is to think about the idea of reminding ourselves of other forms of text which we might use, which goes exactly to your point, Ellen. So the idea that so I suggest that we use just that the notation RVL while you're creating your syllabus. What's the reading that you're asking your students to engage in? What's the viewing? that you want your students to engage in. And then remind yourself, what's the listening? Because, hey, there might be a speech. There might be a bit of music, right? But there also may be short video clips, as we've seen with in other examples, and we've seen with even in terms of the film that we were asked to take a look at, the 24 days. So there are all these new literacies that we can be mindful of as we construct our syllabi. And so the idea of an RVL is a good way for us to keep ourselves honest and to kind of force ourselves to write even more engaging syllabi. So thank you for that point. That's a perfect setup for what I wanted to share with everyone.
I would like to add on that note, so I agree with you, Carlton. It's very important to have a lively curriculum and engage in reading and listening and poetry and music and video. It's very important. But I also want to point out, in this age of social media, we have access to so much information.
That's right.
And no context and no depth and no analysis. I find that frightening. And I was just I was just with a publisher last week here in Oxford from a top publishing house, and they did a survey in the United Kingdom among students doing their first degree, and the average student, their capacity to focus to read is less than 90 seconds. So all of the journals are going to start doing what you've just said. Every 2 or 3 paragraphs, there'll be an embedded video or an embedded music, because we don't have the capacity to focus. And so, yes, we have to, it's an opportunity. We live in an age where we have so much that we can have access to. Like, you know, I was just putting on mute before, just to finish.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, Charles, quickly. But I'm not saying to kind of dumb it down, right? I'm saying, like, we want to extend. And at the same time, you mentioned a very important point, because we're talking about responsibly dealing with text. So it seems to me one of the things we want to do, 2 things. One is we want to continue to push critical thinking, right? So that students can, for instance, discern the reliability of sources, right? It becomes incredibly important in this age of real fake news, right? And disinformation and propaganda that has to be sorted. But also, we haven't really talked much about this, but we've hinted at it, the idea of dealing with primary source material. That's a very delicate issue. I mean, you know, there are certain things you're not just going to put in front of the student and say, decontextualize, you know, you're going to go and read, you know, Mein Kampf or Willie Lynch letters, or just really offensive, unhelpful, hateful material, without at least having it contextualized in a meaningful way and making very critical decisions as the educator about the context. What's the relationship I have with the students? What's the relationship that students have with the text? What is the relationship that students have with one another? What is the relationship that the students have with the past? All of these things become critical for us, I think, as very responsible educators.
No, I agree. I have no argument with you, but at the same time, I'm very concerned. I remember, you know, even the way we get news, you know, if it's on Twitter or Instagram, that's where most people get their news. And, you know, when we were in Oxford back in the day, Carlton, I don't want to sound like an old guy, but you know, there were journalists that would go out into the field for weeks doing documentaries. The news consisted of 3 or 4 stories by seasoned journalists who contextualized an issue. And now we just get this information and talking heads and live streaming images. So this is also, it's, you know, it's the world we live in. There's no going back, but I think contextualizing, having the capacity to analyze, understanding the source of information and knowledge, these are very challenging issues and times, and contribute to some of the problems we're discussing. So it's a challenge. So pedagogy is important to all of this.